If you want to win your fantasy football league this year, you must have the best players on your team. You may think it's hard to do that, but after watching this video, I can guarantee you'll have a much clearer picture of who will be the top guys this year. Without any further ado, let's jump into our first tier, solid options. These guys will not win you your league, but they certainly represent a big asset. For example, Sam Laporta at number 30, who has the potential to be the best fantasy football tight end in 2024. Usually, TEs aren't ranked this high, but given Laporta's role in this offense, I think it is more than fair to give him a spot on these rankings. Moving on, Drake London. Honestly, he has the potential to be a huge fantasy steal now that he has Kirk Cousins thrown to him. However, he has never been a top tier guy, so I wouldn't have too high hopes for him, although he's a rather solid option as number 2 wideout. At number 28, Cooper Kupp. He should be able to bounce back in 2024, but sharing targets with Puka Nacua will probably mean he won't be top 5 as he once was. However, he can be a boom or bust prospect who will potentially be a game changer, whether it is for losing you to big games or leading you to a championship. Up next is Travis Kelce. I honestly do not think he'll be the best tight end in fantasy football, but he'll most certainly be the most consistent one. Casey's wideout room is not really that strong, and Patrick Mahomes already has a rather solid connection with Kelce, so for me that's why he's a top 30 fantasy player. Moving on, we have the first QB of this list, Anthony Richardson. This is the guy who can win you your league in 2024, mark my words. His rushing ability makes him a potentially top 3 fantasy quarterback, and there's not too much hype around him, so make sure to grab him while you can. At number 25 is DK Metcalf. He's already pretty much established as the number 1 wideout in Seattle, so he should be a solid option. However, the Seahawks receiver room is quite good, so he will have to share some targets, meaning his potential is not too impressive. Up next is Chris Olave. So far, he doesn't have too much competition for targets, which means he could end up the season way higher. However, Derek Carr is not what you would call a top tier quarterback, and the Saints offensive scheme limits him to a high-end number 2 fantasy wideout. Moving on, we have the great and consistent players. These guys will either be consistent players getting you good points, or explosive guys capable of carrying your team any given Sunday, such as Travis Etienne. Given his role in the passing game, I wouldn't be surprised if he finished as a top 3 running back in 2024. However, despite his workload, he does lack some consistency, so there's the risk on picking him. Still a great option though. At number 22, Deebo Samuel. He's a solid fantasy wideout and one who can sometimes go off, although he isn't that consistent. His involvement in the rushing game is a nice little bonus, and with how explosive this offense is, there really is no losing with taking him. In 21st place, Lamar Jackson. Second quarterback on this list, and of course it's the reigning MVP. Jackson's rushing abilities make him a rather consistent fantasy QB, who most often than not turns out to be a game changer for the teams that start him. Up next, Nico Collins. He was an amazing fantasy wideout last time around, and he should be able to replicate some of that success. However, this receiving room is arguably the best one in the NFL, so he'll have to share some targets, making him less reliable than last season. Moving on, we have Josh Allen. He's been consistently one of the top fantasy QBs out there, and now that his receiver core is weaker, there's a higher chance he runs more. That means more fantasy points, so I have him as my number 1 quarterback in fantasy. At number 18 is Brandon Ayuk. This guy is incredibly skilled, and he tends to make big plays on a regular basis. He's not the most consistent player out there, but getting him on your team can only be beneficial on the long run. Moving on, we have the superstars. Getting these guys on your team will prove to be an immediate advantage over your competition. Take for example Derrick Henry. The Ravens don't use their running backs much, so Henry probably won't be top 5 in fantasy, but with how good of an actual running back he is, I believe he's probably one of the safest picks you can make. In 16th place, Mike Evans. He always seems to be an underrated fantasy football player. Baker's connection with him is rather solid, and given the fact he tends to have really good stats on a regular basis, I would say he's a safe pick who could ultimately win you your league. Cracking up the top 15 is Saquon Barkley. The Eagles got him for a reason. He's going to get a huge workload. He was already a solid fantasy option in New York, and going to Philly will only help his case, so make sure to get this guy on your team. Up next, Garrett Wilson. Now that Aaron Rodgers is back, he should be on for a really good fantasy season. Wilson is obviously the #1 receiver for the Jets, and he honestly has the potential to be one of the best overall fantasy players in 2024. Moving on is Jonathan Taylor. With how last season went for him, I think there's a chance he falls in most fantasy drafts out there. But regardless, he's still a solid fantasy running back, and the Colts offense is set to improve, so taking him late could end up being a league-winning move. Now let's move on to the next tier, the league changers. These players can be the difference between a good team and a championship one, as they are some of the top fantasy guys out there, starting at number 12 with Puka Nacua. He's already Matthew Stafford's favorite and most reliable target, and although he'll have to share some targets with Cooper Kupp, I'm confident that he'll have yet another good year following an historic rookie season. Moving on, Jahmyr Gibbs. He was one of the best fantasy players once the Lions started using him properly. His involvement in both the rushing and passing game makes him a rather consistent option with the potential to be a league-winning running back. Cracking up the top 10 is Kyren Williams. People don't seem to realize, but in terms of points per game, he was amongst the top fantasy players last year. If he's able to stay healthy, he could end up being the best fantasy running back. So if he's available to you in fantasy drafts, grab him right away. At number 9 is AJ Brown. He had a really good stretch last season, and even his down games weren't that bad. Brown is a great option at wide receiver if you cannot get one of the top guys. As for me, he even has the potential to be better than them. In 8th place, we now have Breece Hall. The Jets offensive line improved a lot this offseason, and he was already a good fantasy player, although he missed some time while injured. He's probably the most explosive running back in the NFL, so I'm sure you want to get a piece of that in your fantasy team. Up next is Bijan Robinson. He didn't really live up to the expectations last year, but it wasn't his fault. Now that the coaching staff changed and he'll have Kirk Cousins as his QB, he's poised to have an amazing fantasy football season, so you would like to have him on the roster. And now we enter the very top tier, the league winners. These guys, if healthy, can be capable of single-handedly carrying your team to a championship, so make sure you do everything you can to get them. First player on this tier is Justin Jefferson. He'll have Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy throwing his way, so there's a risk factor. However, in real life, he's the best wide receiver in the NFL, so that will most certainly translate to fantasy football to at least some degree. Cracking up the top 5, Ja'Marr Chase. Now that Joe Burrow is back, Chase is poised to have probably his best fantasy football season ever. The potential he has is just out of this world, and he has a history of being a really good fantasy player. Up next, Amon-Ra St. Brown. For me, he's the most consistent player you could draft. St. Brown is Jared Goff's favorite target, and arguably a top 5 real-life wideout. He's also really good at scoring touchdowns, so that means you'll be getting a lot of bonus points over the expected. In 3rd place is CeeDee Lamb. He had an amazing season last time around, and there's frankly no reason to believe he'll slow down. His situation is just amazing, so I think he'll most likely be a top 5 fantasy player in 2024. Moving on, we have Tyreek Hill. He constantly gets 100 receiving yards, and he's the #1 wideout in Miami. Hill is a top tier fantasy option who will most likely be going first overall in a lot of drafts, and that's for a reason. And now in 1st place is Christian McCaffrey. His role in the Niners offense make him a rather consistent and explosive fantasy option. There's no reason to dethrone him from the best fantasy player just yet, so I would take him first overall if I had the chance. Anyways, let me know who you think are the best fantasy players for next season. Thanks for watching, and we'll meet again on the next one.